I have kept this household for 31 years, and in that time I learned to expect very little from old men who talk to plants. So when Emrys Vol came to the steward's door that gray morning and asked to see the boy, I did what any sensible chamberlain would do. I sent him away. You have to understand what the Cinder War left us. Before the fires came down out of the north, the Solinari court had kept a grove behind the sickbay wing that was older than the crown itself. A stand of matriarch trees whose bark had been touched by 6 generations of our royal line at their naming, their coronation, and their burial. When the enemy's incendiaries finished with it, there was nothing left but gray stalks and gray ground, and the court botanists, all 9 of them with their instruments and their ledgers, pronounced the grove dead beyond any recovery. That was 11 years before the winter I am telling you about. For 11 years, Emrys Vol had gone out to that ash field every single morning with a bucket and a hand trowel and worked the dead ground anyway, and for 11 years the rest of the palace had let him, the way you let an old man keep talking to a wife who has passed. Nobody stopped him. Nobody believed him either. Then Prince Cormac took sick. It started the way these things always start, with something small. A stiffness in his fingers he blamed on a cold morning. A gray pallor along his knuckles that his nurse noticed and did not like. Within 3 weeks it had crept past his wrists. Our finest physicians called it the gray wilt, an old, half-forgotten blight that used to move through the poisoned soil after the war and, very rarely, into a person who spent too long near it. 9 physicians studied him. 9 physicians tried tonics, cauteries, bloodlettings, prayers. By the 40th day the boy could no longer close his hand around a cup, and the king, who had buried a wife already, sat outside his son's door with his crown in his lap like it weighed nothing at all. That is when Emrys Vol came to my door and asked, plainly, to see the boy. I told him no, I want that on the record, because I am not proud of it. I told him the palace had no time for an old man's superstitions, that better minds than his had already failed, and that his grief for a dead grove had addled him. He stood there in his work coat with the frost still on his shoulders, and did not raise his voice, did not argue, did not so much as blink at the insult. He had heard worse from better men than me, I expect, in 30 years of being the one people stepped around in a hallway. He only said, "The grove isn't dead, steward. It's slow," and he walked back out into the frost with his empty bucket swinging at his side like a man headed to an ordinary day's work. Because as far as he was concerned, that is exactly what it was. I watched him go and told myself I had done my duty. It did not sit easy. I had known Emrys, in the distant way you know palace groundskeepers, since before the war, a quiet widower with no children of his own, and no ambition I had ever seen beyond keeping things alive that other people had given up on. He had never once, in all my years watching him, asked the household for anything. A man who never asked for anything had finally asked, and I had told him no. It was the king himself, 3 days later, hollow-eyed and out of options, who asked me who that old gardener was and why he kept seeing him at the edge of the ash field at dawn. When I told him, badly, the king did something I did not expect. He went out there himself. I followed at a distance, the way you do when you are meant to be keeping order, and instead find yourself simply watching. Emrys was on his knees in the gray dirt, the way he always was, and he did not stand for the king. He barely seemed to notice him, because he had found something. A single green thread, no thicker than a shoelace, pushing up out of the base of what had been the eldest matriarch tree. 11 years of ash, and one rootsucker had waited that whole time to try again. She's not dead, Emrys said. To the king, to himself, to nobody. Root systems on these old matriarchs run deep as the war was long. She just needed longer than any of us wanted to give her. I expected the king to weep, or to rage, or to do any of the large things kings are supposed to do. He only crouched down next to a gardener he had never once spoken to and asked, very quietly, whether that green thread could do anything at all for his son. Emrys didn't promise a miracle. That is the part I want you to understand, because every version of this story that gets told in the taverns now makes it sound like he knew. He didn't know. He said the sap of a matriarch, taken fresh and grafted properly onto living stock, used to be boiled into a wash the old district healers gave for wasting sicknesses, back before anyone trusted physicians with instruments over gardeners with their hands. He said he could not swear the gray wilt was the same sickness those old healers meant. He said the only way to find out was to try, and that trying meant giving that one green thread time to become something worth cutting, which meant more days the prince might not have. The king gave him the days anyway. For 11 weeks Emrys Vol did not leave that ash field except to sleep. He built a low glass frame over the chute with his own 2 hands, out of window panes begged from the palace's broken wing, fitting each cracked pane into a wood frame he'd planed himself so no draft could reach the seedling inside. He fed that thread nothing but water he'd carried up from the lower cistern in a pail he refused to let any servant carry for him, and warmth from a small charcoal brazier he tended through the coldest nights himself, sleeping in a canvas tent pitched close enough to hear if the fire dropped. There was a stretch in the 4th week when a hard frost came early, and the little branch blackened along one edge, and I found him at dawn sitting beside it with his own coat over the glass, saying nothing, waiting to see if it would hold. It held. The court physicians came out twice to look at him, and left shaking their heads, muttering about an old man's grief curdling into delusion. I came out more than twice myself, and by the 6th week I had stopped shaking my head along with them, and started, quietly, bringing him tea. By the 81st day the shoot had become a slender branch as long as my forearm, and Emrys judged it ready. He did not perform some grand ritual. He took a grafting knife he'd owned since before I knew him, cut a clean diagonal sliver of bark and cambium from the new branch, and grafted it onto a hardy stock seedling he'd been keeping alive in a clay pot by his own hearth for exactly this purpose, binding the join with beeswax and wax twine the way, he told me, his own grandmother had taught him to graft apple stock 60 years before any of this palace's business had touched his life. Then he waited another 9 days for the graft to take, boiled the first small harvest of sap into a plain wash exactly as the old district recipe said, and carried it himself, in a chipped cup, to the prince's sick room. The physicians objected. Of course they objected. An old man's folk cure, untested, unlicensed, offered to an heir to the throne. The king silenced them with a single raised hand and told Emrys to go ahead. I was in that room. I watched a gardener with dirt still under his fingernails hold a boy's ruined hand steady while he worked the warm wash into his gray knuckles, patient as a man kneading dough, saying nothing grand, only, now and then, there now. There now. He did that every evening for 6 days. On the 4th evening the boy's fingers curled, just slightly, around the old man's thumb. On the 6th, the gray along his hands had gone the pink of a boy who has simply been out too long in the cold. The king offered Emrys a title, a wing of the palace, a permanent place among the household staff with rank enough that men twice his birth would have to bow to him. Emrys turned all of it down, plain as anything, and asked instead only for what he had always had, leave to keep tending the grove until his knees gave out, and a promise that nobody would call it a dead field again. That is what the king granted him, and nothing more, though the boy himself, grown now and crowned in his own right, still walks out to that grove every year on the first morning its blossoms open, and sits with an old gardener too stubborn to admit he is dying, and says nothing at all, because by now neither of them needs to. I have kept this household 31 years. I no longer expect very little from old men who talk to plants.